Just a quick disclaimer, or actually maybe not a disclaimer, more of an explanation of my background. My background's I have a professional degree in architecture, and my PhD's in philosophy, which is to say, this was my first experience in archival work. So it was quite eye-opening for several reasons. But what I wanted to do, instead of talking about my larger project, which I'll get to, is to actually look at the strategic uses of how the archives really helped me in developing the idea itself, my research topic itself. So basically it was, as the title suggests, a comparative account of two designers who immigrated, Eliel from Finland, Raymond Loewy from France, to the US early 20th century, and both wrote books on design by the mid-century. So I was comparing their text. So it was text-based, and what I was looking for at the archives were essentially evidence that corroborated their stories, which not surprisingly, I did find for the most part. But also I was looking for context and ways to contextualize not only their words, but also letters that were written to them, other authors, other designers, writing letters, and a general context, more about how their personalities and whether it infiltrated beyond the text that they had written for public consumption. So that was the second thing, and I also found a lot of information on that. The third thing was actually not something I quite expected. It was the surprise factor of archival work. And that to me was the most exciting part, where I would, based on finding aids, assume I would hit certain information or not. But it was more the surprises that were exciting, where it made me rethink the project or look at it a different way, or find a different personality trait in the authors themselves and the designers themselves. So what I'd like to do is to go through essentially kind of give you a photo tour of what I've done so far, and talk a little bit about the three strategies of evidence, context, and surprise embedded in particular moments. So let's start with Eliel. So this was in Cranbrook in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Eliel came from, as the middle image suggests, he essentially won second place for the Tribune Tower competition. He didn't win, but he gained so much accolades for his work within the US that he was invited by University of Michigan to come and teach there, and then eventually was also invited to Cranbrook by George Booth to head that architecture program. So that essentially, this was his invitation to the US. The top image is his American citizenship paper. And again, that's one of those moments where I go, wow, look, it's on paper, because you see it in his books, but it's not. Somehow it has more reality when you see it in an image. There's my little laptop in the archives. They were in the process of moving, and I'll talk about how important it was to actually be at Cranbrook in a moment. Partly because the architectural site itself was evidence of his work. So what I was also looking for is not only what I would find in the archives, but also whether his theories of organic architecture principles translated into the practice itself. And we'll look at an image related to that. Here we see him with Frank Lloyd Wright, a photograph taken with Wright, and Wright often visited Cranbrook. I think the last count was eight times, I think. So that again shows that he was very much conversant with the American designers, the local designers, in terms of having more of being involved in a design discourse larger than Cranbrook. So what I was looking for in the Cranbrook archives in particular was a sense of Eliel Saarinen's personality, because he carries a very professional tone in his writing, The Search for Form, that was published in 1948, 2 years before he died. And it has he carries a very professorial, pedagogical tone. So I was looking for a bit more on his personality. So this image is one of those cases where I want to talk a little bit about how the Cranbrook site itself bespeaks of his philosophy. And this was the Cranbrook dining hall, and all it is a window in the dining hall. And to me, and this is one example of numerous examples across campus, where the basic idea was the protection of the whole, where the parts would deviate slightly or alternate a little bit, but the priority was given to the consistency of the whole structure. So in this case, for example, in the window, can you tell what's different by any chance? Yeah, the tracery, the metal tracery is all different in each panel. None of the panels match. So, and this is the trick he uses throughout campus, where on first glance it looks very traditional, very expected, very unified. It's only when you pay attention to the details you see the nuances emerge, the diversity emerge. And again, it was evidence of his organic principle of design. So just walking around campus was it just went on to corroborate what I was looking for to begin with. Just a few other images. This is more like going through a photo book. So this was an unpublished 1925 mission statement for Cranbrook. And although, in the finding aids you see it as unpublished, it's hard to anticipate what you would find in such a document. So this was one of those moments where I went, that's exciting. But other people did not necessarily find that particularly exciting. But anyway, so it goes on to show the motivation for the whole school itself. And as a philosopher, I found that to be so exciting, because that was the whole sort of philosophical push to why have a design school anyway. So this is one of those instances where it gave a little bit more context to his work, a little bit more information that I didn't have previously. So here's another letter. This is from Frank Lloyd Wright in 1932, August 30th, and you can see Wright's letterhead and all that. And it's talking to Eliel Saarinen, and they're actually discussing sort of a grant for students. And again, this was interesting to me because it set up a discussion between the architects and designers of the time. And that kind of engagement was interesting to me, to see that Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't particularly amenable to other architects. He was quite satisfied with himself, so it was amusing to me to find him actually talking to someone else. And there's all these jokes about him going to Eliel Saarinen's house, and Saarinen had his fire logs all set up nice, pristinely, symmetrically, and all of that. And he goes and knocks it over with his cane and says something derogative like, oh, this is too tight or too organized. And Eliel Saarinen's retort was, you are always frank, but not always right. And that's like the big joke, that he's not always right. So anyway, so there was all these jokes related to their relationship and all of that. So it added a little bit of personality to Eliel Saarinen that I was looking for. Another document that I don't have up here is a poem that George Booth had written for Eliel Saarinen for his 60th birthday. And that gave a lot of information on Eliel Saarinen's personality. So those are those little clues, not actually from him, but by people, from people about him. Even he was called Pappy that's something I didn't know from the book. So in Cranbrook, his nickname is Pappy. Thanks to the wonderful archivist there, Leslie Edwards, and I have a completely new respect for archivists and all that they know. They're just full of information. So that's fantastic. So she urged me to look at the administrative records, which I hadn't thought of doing. But actually looking at the administrative records was very, very helpful, because what essentially that did was to give me an account of the literal account of the changes in the structure itself. When the library was added, when the museum was added, who was paid what. One surprising fact that I was surprised that Saarinen, who taught textiles, made significantly less salary than her male peers at Cranbrook, which is so details like that were both surprising and I hadn't expected to find, and also this is just 1 year, so there was a sequence of years. So if I lined up all the years together, I could get a good picture of administratively how Cranbrook was developing. So these are a few specific examples of how just going into the archives helped with the offered evidence, offered context, and also those moments of surprise. So I'll come back to that in a bit, but before I do, let me go to Raymond Loewy. So Raymond Loewy was a very different figure from Eliel Saarinen, which is why the comparison was interesting to me. Raymond Loewy had a lot of personal information. I was working from his autobiography, 1951, Never Leave Well Enough Alone. He gives an immense amount of personal information. So what I was looking for in this case is actually the opposite of Eliel Saarinen. I was looking for his official tone, his office records, his memos, how he actually operated, because that storyline was missing. And more importantly, Raymond Loewy was an industrial designer, came to the US 1919, immigrated from France, ends up becoming one of the founders of IDSA, very important in American industrial design, the development of American industrial design. And he was also the only foreigner, only immigrant in the first 4 founding IDSA members. So what we have is on the top we have Raymond Loewy's cover. He was the first industrial design to be on the cover of Time magazine, 1951. And the subtext reads, he streamlines the sales curve. So all corporate, very opposite of Eliel Saarinen. Here's one of the many boxes related to the Loewy archive in Hagley, Delaware. So the top 2 are interesting because the story of Loewy's arrival to the U.S., the usual immigrant story, came with $25. That number, of course, ranges between 25 to 50. But he comes with, a certain amount of dollars in his French uniform. Works very hard as an illustrator, gets fired from Macy's because they didn't like his window dressings, blah, blah. And then he ends up becoming an industrial designer and opens his office in 1929 of all years. So that storyline is very well documented and often repeated as this story of American immigrant success. But in 1976, RLI, his firm, goes bankrupt. And no one really talks about the decline of Raymond Loewy and what constituted that. So what essentially I was looking for is any evidence of decline. So the top middle is his bill of sales for the company. And the right is he had gotten a letter from an employee talking about talking about the difficulties of the office, lack of management, that sort of thing. So he writes a note saying, please distribute among yourself, emphasis on confidential nature. So again, a few examples of specific items that I found. Loewy's bragging spoils his book. His calendar, where whole weeks are devoted to, he's in Paris for 2 weeks, so a lot of traveling. This is the list he made up after he sold the company of his personal items in his office that he needs to take out. So he'd like to take with him. So that's poignant because it has, for example, John Kennedy's photograph and a painting copy of Miro. And so that personalized him in a very different way than what we see in kind of public imagery. I also found an unpublished book. This was supposed to be a textbook for industrial design students. I found this the most comforting thing I've ever seen because of this whole idea of working through a thought and just crossing it out. That made me feel so much better. And then the whole never written idea. He writes never written. And it's part of my book also has to do with why his textbook didn't really work, because he was very anti-history in theory. And here is a letter dated 1958. The surprise here was how early this letter is, because he ends up selling RLI in 1976. So this suggests that his worries about the company went far beyond the 70s. This is as early as 1958. So that date was very surprising to me, and that essentially gave his ascension 20 years and his decline 20 years in his company, which was quite a find. Cosmo, there was an article on Raymond Loewy's work, but what I found was from the Raymond Loewy's recipe book. So part of the article included 3 recipes: champagne and peaches, sherbet, and chocolate caramel sauce or something like that. So I thought that was really interesting, that idea of associating his personal life into. And this is I found Lafayette, and that was another exciting moment. Lafayette in modern design history, who knew? So Lafayette and the whole idea of 1972 and how that was supposed to be the epitome of modern departmental store shopping. So that's an aside, but that was a nice find too. So essentially what ended up happening is I pitched the book to publishers, and one publisher really liked the Raymond Loewy part and said that was the commercial idea. He was more commercially viable than Eliel Saarinen, which I found weirdly appropriate because it's Raymond Loewy, and also kind of sad because I really hoped to set up the comparison. But as it stands now, this book is about Raymond Loewy himself, and where I began was with his recipes. So the book is organized according to why he presented his recipes to Cosmopolitan in 1950, and what that had to do with his design philosophy and his experiences, and how do you innovate new dishes, essentially. So it's based on that whole theme. So in terms of future directions, that book is I'm just in the editing process now, trying to do those footnotes, which is tedious. So working on the footnotes. So I still have Pappy to work on and write about. And going with the food theme and consumerism, consumption, modern design, I'd like to look at refrigerators and blenders because of how it was sold to women in the 30s, which is, the storyline is very interesting. So to that end, I've already been to the National Museum of American History. So now I'm hooked to archival research. Thank you very much for that. And I have also about 3 years worth of work to mine from this. So thank you, JP, for helping me with your letter and all that. And I truly appreciated it. And it was quite a learning process. It was a journey, and archival research is great. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions for Professor Banu.
Please, questions. Yes.
Into the
I'm curious about the Lafayette Ayers. Have you
Yeah.
actually gone into the building and
No,
looked at
no,
it?
I haven't
can't
been-
remember what's in there now. Used to be. What's in there now? No, Macy's is at the mall. This is the original one. Yeah.
I think what the big innovation that he was trying to promote, actually his architecture partner, Ben, was that so essentially taking away all the windows where you'd have the storage on the outside and make the interior more important. Whereas departmental stores usually used to be about looking outside in. So he essentially inverts the departmental store and makes it completely about the product, less about the social aspect of it.
So this is the Market Square?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah, the
exactly.
Market Square one, yeah.
So that's another paper right there, Lafayette and Modern Design.
Okay, any other questions?
Any other questions?
For Lisa?
There was a lot to look at, so it was really a discovery, an archaeology right there. Thank you.